What kind of challenges did you face cutting a show like The X-Files?
Well, I don't know about a show like The X-Files. The X-Files itself, if I recall, when we did the pilot. So doing the pilot, it was fun to be part of the whole process of discovering what the show was going to be, and dealing with what was still kind of a raw talent, especially in Gillian, and David having to discover how he was going to play this character. As I recall, in the pilot, I felt like I had to sort of tone Gillian down. She was playing the character as a bit strident and a bit bitchy. And David was playing his character as very all-knowing and very low-key because he was so all-knowing, which I found in the one case, it was perhaps not as appealing to have could have Scully come across like that. And on the other hand, it was hard to be as dramatic if your main character was just sort of almost blasé about everything, especially since he was supposed to be into these amazingly wild, crazy. So, just so watching them from the pilot until later on, as they developed, and it didn't take that long, but they developed into the characters they became, where Gillian was kind of softer but wise, and always pleasantly skeptical, and Mulder was a bit more. He was a bit more energetic and figured out how to be funny, which I remember the first couple of times that, at least that I edited material where David had lines that were basically humorous. For some reason, I can't remember what it was now, but for some reason they didn't work. If it was a delivery thing, or I don't know. But what was great was all those things got ironed out, and there was until Gillian became an amazing actress. When you're an editor, if you have a feeling like at this point I want to be on Scully, and you look at your footage of Scully and she's giving you the performance you want right then, it's just really fun to put together. And David was the same way. He was giving you what you wanted when you wanted it. So yeah, I do remember that it took a little while for them to find that. The other challenges, well, we were doing I don't know if it was a challenge, but it was interesting, the whole approach to how we portrayed the scary stuff. You may have heard someone say that Matt Beck, our visual effects supervisor, said that everything in X-Files would be either too dark to see or too bright to see. And which was cool, because it was all about leaving stuff to the imagination. And I think that Chris really wanted to be unconventional, wanted to find unconventional ways to tell stories. And I love that, because I like to be unconventional. But sometimes, every once in a while, you try something wild and it doesn't work. And we had a representative of the studio who would come in and sit with us, sort of take kind of an executive pass with us, named Ken Horton. And Ken was wonderful, because he was open to everything, but his solutions to everything were generally conventional. And that was kind of cool, because you could really bounce stuff off him. If you had done something wild and it worked for him, then you knew it was working. And if it didn't work for him, he would say, well, maybe instead of that, you could do this thing. And his suggestion was always the cliche thing, but there's a reason there are cliches. It's because they work. You know, people recognize them, and you get by that. So that was interesting. So I don't know if I'm really answering the question about challenges, but these are memories I have of you know, what was sort of fun almost to me about the show. And for me personally, the other thing for me personally, nothing to do with editing, I guess, but I discovered the internet thanks to the X-Files. I didn't know about it until the X-Files. And I remember writers walking in. I remember James Wong walking in to my cutting room with a sheaf of printouts of things that people had said about the show the morning after it had aired. And that was unheard of, that you could have instant feedback from people. And to this day, I have this kind of feeling that the people who were drawn to the X-Files and the people who were the early adapters of or adopters of the internet back then were maybe some of the same people, and that put it out there on the internet and it got talked about. And that I wouldn't be surprised if anybody would actually study it, that you'd find that had a lot to do with its explosive popularity. Brand new. I wasn't on the internet. I finally got my first internet account back when you still had to type command lines and learn all that stuff to make anything happen. And I got my first internet account because I wanted to check out what was going on the internet. And I remember the first time I participated in an internet chat. Let me see if I can recreate this. There had been a scene. It might have been a season finale, but it was one of our Star Chamber scenes, and one of the inquisitors, one of the FBI inquisitors, was Chris. He played the role. And I remember cutting the scene. I remember that he only had like a line to say. He had written the line. He couldn't do the line. It was hysterical. It was really hard. Anyway, I think after that one aired, but the line he was accusing Scully of doing something that, and he was right and she was trying to deny it. It was something like that. And so I would just, as they now call it, lurking, right? I would just sort of go into these chat rooms and I'd watch the chats go by, and somebody says, you know, I heard a rumor that Chris Carter was actually in this episode. And somebody wrote, yeah, he was the person who had that line, you know, to Scully and caught her in the lie. It's something like this. Caught her in the lie. And he was right, he said. So I wrote the first thing I ever wrote in a chat room, which was, well, it just goes to show you can't fool Chris. To which somebody replied, well, of course he knew she was lying. He'd written the script. Okay, and so the whole blurring of, you know, Chris and the character he plays and the writer, and you know, people would get they'd read about David Duchovny's dog, and it would become Mulder's dog, and it was. Yeah, it was just jumping into this whole new world, which now, of course, we're bemoaning because we feel like it's ruined the country. But then it was a lot of fun.
I just want to go back to what you were saying on the pilot with David and Gillian. How did you approach, you know, if David was coming off one way and Gillian was coming off another way, how do you approach as an editor? Like, does it just take really analyzing every single take to get it? So, because they didn't come off the way you were saying that they were, you know, initially coming off. They were Mulder and Scully from the beginning. How do you approach that?
Well, of course, to start with, it wasn't like I had some cheat sheet that said this is how they're supposed to come across. Like any editor, I'm reacting emotionally to how I react to them. And so, I mean, I guess you're right. It's a bit of just combing through and finding, just piecing together those moments that you can use, that you feel are okay. That's a good one, right? And making the scene out of that, and if sometimes it means you have to cut it a little faster and a little, just don't let the audience see too much. Generally, when things are not exactly the way I want them to be, I speed up. I take my time. If I'm enjoying, if I like a performance, I take more time with it. If it's if I'm thinking maybe this needs help, I find ways to speed up. Or we all steal reactions, right? You find a look. I recall, I'm quite certain there was a scene with Gillian where I needed her to I wanted a certain look from her, and the only way I could get it was to print one of her shots backwards, so that reversed her an expression, and that worked. And I don't recall ever doing that again. I remember doing it in the pilot and never again. And so, and yeah, I mean, that pilot was a lot of fun because we spent, like all pilots in those days, you didn't go home, right? You spent, the schedules were crazy. And so you had these very smart people, Chris, Danny Sackheim, pretty sure was one, the director, Bob Mandel, and I would just sit in the room and try to figure out what the show was going to be. And we laughed a lot. I just remember having a lot of fun on that show. I remember one of the challenges, actually. So one of the things was, right, that the Scully character had to be the scientist. Well, Gillian is not that. She once said that in the real world, she would be the more likely person to believe in extraterrestrials, and David would be more likely the skeptic. I was at a rap party once where they had a hypnotist, and he did Gillian, and she went under like that.
Oh, really?
So she had to be the scientist, and sometimes at first she had a little issue. She had trouble getting sounding like she knew what she was talking about. Another thing that she overcame really quickly. I mean, you totally believe for most of that run of that show that she's the rational thinking,
right.
But I don't know. There was a scene, I think it was in a cemetery, right, where Mulder gets it's raining, it's in a cemetery, and Mulder gets some big insight into what's been going on in this little town of.
Oh no, they're standing in the street.
Oh, I thought it was a cemetery. Well, let's see.
You're talking about the pilot? Yeah. Well, he had written the X, and isn't that when the time stopped? Is that what you're talking about? Time stop. I don't remember.
Talking about he's kind of piecing something together about what happened in this town. They go up to
Oregon.
Bellflower.
Bellflower, Oregon. Yeah.
Bellflower, which was, and Chris, who'd grown up in the South Bay of Los Angeles, just took the town of Bellflower, which is down there. And
yeah. Paint build there.
Right. So anyway, I just recall there was a scene in the rain at night. Of course, everything was at night.
Everything.
And Gillian couldn't get the lines, and they just went over and over and over again until when, and it's all about Mulder trying to piece this all together for her, and she's gonna kind of get what he's been saying all along. And when he finally says yes, it was like, I wasn't sure whether he was saying yes because the character understood what he was saying, or because Gillian had finally gotten the line. It was cold and rainy, and I think that scene was supposed to have them in triumph about this, having figured it out, start howling like dogs at the moon, which I think they did. And as I recall, it was so ridiculous. I couldn't bear to leave it. I don't remember whether I took it out or everybody else decided to take it out, but I just remember it couldn't stay. It was one of those things where can't stay in the show. It just can't. I guess there was supposed to be like wolves howling at the moon.
I think that would have ended it right there.
So you mentioned Bill Davis. I mean, and you probably know this story. He was, as far as I know, just an extra in another one of these star chamber scenes where I guess it was Scully was being questioned, and he just stood there smoking. Somebody just had him smoking, and it was brilliant. Who knew he was going to be what he became?
He's the best.
So, I mean, and that's a lot of the fun of doing something like this is how the things you aren't necessarily, it isn't necessarily engineered, sort of evolve out of it. And he was one of those things.
You also did Fight the Future, right?
Right, which I, thanks to you, having called me up for this, and I've told you I teach a class at Chapman University, I decided I would run that for my editing students, and so we could discuss. And it had been a while since I had revisited it. And it is mind-boggling how timely that is. It's just mind-boggling that we've discovered that the aliens are viruses, and that the evil guys are trying to come up with a vaccine. And the Martin Landau character is talking about the constitutional crisis by, FEMA, the deep state. And I mean, he doesn't use that term, but and I've joked to people occasionally that with all this business of nobody trusting the government anymore, so nobody wants to wear masks, but I just wonder if I had anything to do with that, with the trust no one slogan. And it's something I say kind of for a laugh, but that movie was just, you just watch that movie now, almost everything in it somehow has something to do with what's going on right now. It's spooky, Mulder. Anybody who was involved with it for any length of time, that was an important part of their lives. And I remember once, when Shaquille O'Neal was playing for the Lakers, some reporter asked him, well, if you had to defend yourself, how would you do that? And he said, well, I can't answer that. It's an X-File. And I thought, wow, I mean, it's just really, it's part of the culture. Forget beyond the shows. It's actually a whole cultural thing. And if you're part of that, how can you not feel good that you got to be a part of that?
When you did the movie, I mean, how do you approach doing a TV show versus a movie? I mean, it's a much big, I know X-Files was always like a movie individually, but this was a movie with a lot of effects for 1998. Like, how does that differ from your approach?
I had a bigger crew.
Okay. You get more time. I mean, I know you get
time with things. Yeah, I could take more time with things, and also, of course, Rob Bowman. Have you talked to Rob?
Not yet. We haven't heard back from him.
The director, brilliant. Just Rob, David, Kim. I mean, what brilliant directors they had. Rob, would come in and we would work on things together before it was finished. I was used to sitting down with the director after I cut the whole thing, and then we could respond to the pieces as a whole show. But this wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work to do that for a feature, and you have to get the visual effects people started. So you needed to get the visual effects scenes going. And they brought in another editor actually to do visual effects, some visual effects scenes. And then he finally left, and then we realized that we were going to actually needed more shots for the big finale. So they had to schedule a reshoot. So I had to go back in and do a lot of sort of redo some of that. So it became like seeing the cuts with animatics, as they call, which are kind of like storyboards of the visual effects, became informed what was going to happen next. So so in some ways I was a lot more involved with the production people than I would be in a TV show where, of course, when I was on X-Files, it was in a whole other city, right? It was in Vancouver. Something, see, now I had a thought that I was going to throw in and went blank on it about the.
Is it harder? I mean, I've never really worked with visual effects. From an editor standpoint, is it very difficult to edit where you're essentially leaving out chunks where it's green screen or however they're digitally imprinting it into the Avid system? Like, is that very difficult to edit with? Where you're really putting the scene together, but it's David and Gillian with nothing behind them.
Right. Well, of course, they're counting on me actually to take those foreground elements, and create the timing. Because for one thing, you don't want to, in a visual effects movie, you don't want to spend more money on effect than you actually have to. So they try to keep it as close to the cuts as possible. But again, here you're in an early version, so things can change. So yeah, I mean, I think it was fun. It was fun to know that this is, you look at the storyboard, this was supposed to happen here, and then here's the action you actually have, and back and forth. There were a few times where it was kind of talk to the visual effects people about a shot in which how the shot evolved was going to have a lot more to do with the timing than what I was doing. And hopefully you got pre-visualizations or early versions to rougher versions to work with. So there's a lot of back and forth between the cutting room and the effects people, and that was not something that really happened much with this series. So I enjoyed that. And I just enjoyed having the time to really make things right. As I recall also, one of the challenges of that was the evolving, whatever they were, the virus monsters in those frozen capsules that burst open at the end.
Yeah.
I guess a lot of that was puppetry, and they were more constrained. They were constrained. They were supposed to be scary and burst out of there. And I recall there was a lot of a lot of editing trickery to make that exciting. And much as I was saying about the performances in the pilot, you just have to take those frames that work and not one frame more. And I learned a lot from Rob, who's a wonderful action director too, working with him and in terms of what he wanted to do and ideas he had. So yeah, I mean, it was that was probably, as I think of it, really the biggest challenge of that movie were those for me, the editing challenge were those.
Well, you killed it.
It was an idea, it was an idea that Chris had, and then they went with it in the script. I don't know to what extent they tested how much they could test it beforehand. It just seemed like, or maybe things they thought were going to work differently than they did. So that was an interesting. That was really an interesting.
Do you have a favorite memory or favorite episode from working on the show, or both?
A favorite memory. I really liked Jose Chung from Outer Space. Working on that was just delightful, and that was working with Glenn's. Oh, how am I? Glenn.
Morgan. Glenn Morgan.
His brother's name was.
Yeah, Glenn Morgan.
Glenn Morgan's brother, but.
Darren Morgan.
Darren. Oh, thank you. Sorry, Darren. Darren was like Sherlock Holmes's brother, you know. He was like, Glenn was brilliant and Darren was even more brilliant. And very, very funny. And the chance to bring humor. Actually, I love the other episode that so wait, no, the one I did was not, Jose Chung was the one I liked, which I didn't do. The one I was Peter Boyle was in it.
Clyde Bruckman's
Final Repose. That was the one I cut, which was enormous fun. And I think, by the way, overcut, we had, because of the time constraints for a TV episode, you have to have it has to be kind of no more than this many minutes. I actually thought I had a very slightly longer version of that, maybe 2 or 3 minute longer version, which I think was better. And in trying to squeeze that into it's one of the rare times I've actually had to make something shorter. I thought it got a little bit worse. Not a lot. I would
like to have seen that then.
and that was a kick in that. Is TV Guide still published? I don't know if the people.
It is, but yes, it is online, I think.
I remember they had a 50th anniversary special one point, and they did like this list of the 10 best TV shows in the previous 50 years, and that Clyde Bruckner show came in 10th. Yeah. And there was, I believe, the ER pilot was the only hour show that came ahead of it. The rest of the shows ahead of it were sitcoms.
I think I have that magazine.
I got a kick out of that. So that was almost everything working with Darren was a good memory. And then he thanked me when he got his Emmy for doing that.
That's great.
And my mother got to see it.
That's awesome.
And my mother got to see it. How did that work? They tape delayed, right? They did the Emmys live in the East and tape delayed it in the West. So I was at an after party at Spago or something, waiting for everybody to show up, and wasn't aware that he had thanked me. And then I got to go home and found out my mother had seen it, that was really cool.
That's awesome.
So I gave him he walked in and I gave him a big hug. Because who thanks the editor on national TV? And who pays any attention to it except the editor's mother? But I cut the first episode that David Nutter directed, the ICE episode, and that led to our working together on any number of things later on, including the Millennium pilot for Chris. I also cut Rob Bowman, the first episode that Rob Bowman directed, and both of those guys, became part of the club. So I'm really proud that I had something to do with that, although mostly it was them, of course. I loved cutting the what they call the saga, the saga episodes, the ones that dealt with the conspiracies and the Smoking Man and Deep Throat and all that kind of stuff. I really enjoyed those. Although David's first episode was a kind of an homage to The Thing, I think it was, or the ICE one.
So the question we ask, our last question, is one we ask everybody. And you'll probably, when I ask the question, you'll probably know for editing purposes why I'm asking it. But if you could say something to the fans over the last 27 plus years, what would it be?
Thank you. I mean, it's just, you made my day, you made my life. I mean, look, this made my career, right? So before X-Files, I was another editor looking for work. And after X-Files, I was the fellow who did the pilot of the X-Files, which will probably be the lead line in my obituary too, right? So, now you have, in Hollywood, a track record is everything. To be involved in something that's both good and successful. And after that, it gets a lot easier. My students ask me all the time, how do I break in and what do I do? And I say, well, if you can work it out to be the editor of the pilot of the X-Files, you're in good shape.
That'll do it.
So, I mean, Chris deserves most of that thanks, and Rob and David and all those people, but boy, the fans, I've raised, thanks to them, I put my kids to college.